Okay, I'm Kathy Lobato Martinez. I'm on the art committee, and welcome to all of you. And I'm very pleased to introduce Carina Yepez. She's a fiber and textile. She will speak on threading community. Her art explores a lot of areas: immigration, matriarchy, and healing through quilting and other fiber arts. She will tell us about her personal artistic journey, which should be very interesting, and how it's led to a passion for her to want to connect with communities through her art. She's a Chicago-based artist, and she's an educator with roots in Guanajuato, Mexico, and she has a master's in fine arts from the School of the Art Institute, and she's a lecturer at the Art Institute, and also has worked with a community arts center, the Firebird, in East Garfield Park, and she's worked with a collective of women at the National Museum of Mexican Art, which is where I discovered her. And these women come together to share stories and quilts. And she curated an exhibit that they had there called Puntadas del Alma. And that translates to Stitches of the Soul. So please welcome Carina.
I'm Carina Yepez. I'm really happy to be here. I'll stand on my tiptoes in moments just so everyone can see me, but I'll also stand over here. That feels better. So I began my conversation with my grandfather, who was a bracero and came to the United States in an amnesty program in the 1960s. And he is pictured here in the center with his hat on. He was interviewed by the Smithsonian Institution, and if you're interested in this, he is one of hundreds that was interviewed. And this process was leaving home, leaving his family, working the fields, and resisting. And so that is where I come from. That is a story of many families. And so this is a piece that I created based off of a photograph that I took, because part of the legacy that I would like to share about my grandfather is that he was able to save and learn, and with his community purchase his own crops and go back to Mexico and cultivate the land with his own hands and teach these values to his family, to his children, to his grandchildren. And so I took this photograph in 2016, and when I started working with the quilting group, I wanted to replicate it with traditional applique and some patchwork here, but this is a quilt I created with that process. Another one of my origin stories is what I consider one of my first art teachers, which is my uncle, Carina Yepez. He really did a captivating job to photograph what he considered to be his legacy in the towns he grew up, the people that he was raised with. I love these similarities because you can see on the left-hand side, there's still not concrete, like rubble. The dirts were still not concrete. And then on the right side, we see a little bit of this infrastructure building. And just to demonstrate this, this resilience and the story of leaving a home for opportunity or for something different. We grew up going to Mexico often, and before we had access to so much technology, we would make the drive. We would gather in a truck. Actually, it was this one here that you see on the right-hand side. I am one of 6 children, and I'll get into that in the next image. But we would drive from Chicago to Guanajuato, which is right in the heart of the country there. And we would stop sometimes in Dallas, sometimes we would drive straight through with the brakes of gasoline and potty brakes for the children. But being in a community, being with cousins and aunties, siblings, and the parents, you see this road evolve. You see the change from where I was living at the time, either Little Village or Cicero, and then you're driving through this countryside and you see how the country is changing, how the landscape is changing all the way to Guanajuato, right? I think that's a big impact in my artistic career. My community are my siblings. Thank you, sister, for being here. I think that culturally, and that is where I also learn a lot about my values, right? Like, we work in community, we learn from each other, we rely on each other, but I have worked continuously in a lot of different communities, and something that I talk about a lot is that initial community that we create, right? And even learning and unlearning and going through the process of relationships, right? This is the first relationship that I get to be a part of, whether I wanted it or not, but evolving with it and learning from it, right, teaches me throughout my artistic career what community really means and what I want to define it as. This is me as a preschooler. I remember this moment very vividly because art was my language. Every time I had a choice to be in a center, I wanted to go to art. As I was creating this piece, I was weaving it, and I started thinking about who I am today, and thinking about that little girl, thinking about that inner child, and even some of the things that I found in relationship with it, like the way I still use my bracelets today, and how I loved that bracelet. And I remember placing it down and just not wanting to get it dirty, but the delicacies and the person that I was and who we evolved to be, but then in our core, we're still this person, right? And a lot of that process I do and teach in my university, with my community. One of my approaches to teaching is I will teach at the same level, whether it is at the School of the Art Institute or at Firebird Community Arts or in Puntadas del Alma, right? Because we all have the opportunity to learn at this potential scales, right? And talking about community projects and talking about community-based theory. This is an image that I took. So my paternal grandmother was an icon in our family. I like to tell the story about her when we went to her funeral, and all of the grandchildren were mingling with her friends, and we showed up for her because she just made us all feel like we were all her favorites. And then we would all maybe casually be like, I'm her favorite, no, I'm her favorite. But then we started talking to her friends, and they started saying that they were all her favorite. And we would come back to each other, and I would be like, did you hear that that's Grandma's favorite friend? And then another cousin would be like, did you hear that Grad's friend? And we were like, everyone was Grandma's favorite. And that was how she also cultivated, that that core, right? That family, that dynamic. She grew up with very little, but her richness was her love, which was her community. And so when she passes away, I have a pause in my creative practice. I'm not able to move. I stop. I just felt like my hands were just like still. And I started to remember how my mother lost her mother when I was 6 years old. So I was this little girl like this. And seeing my mom go through this grief gave me an understanding of that. I would catch her crying, I would ask her what's wrong, and she wanted to be strong for me. So I went to my paternal grandmother's home, and I started uncovering things, and I started opening drawers, and I started unpacking. And I found her sewing machine, and you can see the dust just slightly sprinkled over it. I found her threads, and I wondered, was she the last person who touched these items? And I found her beautiful velvet box that was just kept so beautifully. And I also thought, wow, what did she make with these, right? And I do remember sitting there when she was sewing, and I would just hear the check, 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 right? The up and down, the movement of the machine. Until this day, it's one of my meditations, right? When I start sewing and get lost in that noise. But then I started to explore the textiles, right? What happens with these items that are sewed? And traditionally in the town, the women would sew to prepare for a home of their own, to prepare their curtains and their bed sheets and their linens and their tablecloths. And these are all treasures that I started to find and identify. This is my paternal grandmother's closet. My maternal grandmother's closet was already over 30 years, tampered with or not kept in shape, but I was able to take my paternal grandmother's photograph, and she had her daughters, where's my arrow? Well, you can see, I'll walk up to it. You can see little papers in some of the garments underneath that they're all labeled by sizes. You can identify some very old fabrics with some modern ones that were being brought from the United States by her children. And so I saw this closet, and I just felt like this moment of belonging, of warmth, right? And how we don't cultivate these closets as that conversation. These are just things that women have, right? That they have at home. I'm curious here, how many of you know or have a linen closet? Yeah, and it continues to be the warmth of the home. It continues to be the life when you change your linen from, a season or a holiday, or you have a guest over and you bring that special linen out for your table, right? And so I begin to explore that conversation alongside the curatorial aspect of your selection. And in this specific moment, I'm thinking about my grandmother's selections. So on the left-hand side is my paternal grandmother. On the right-hand side is my maternal grandmother. And both coming from very different social classes, if you will, and families and resources. And I thought this was their selection, florals, right? The delicacy and the feminine. And the work, this is my maternal grandmother. So she had a routine after I interviewed all of her daughters. My mom and her sister were the two firstborns, right? And so they had a routine, waking up at 4 a.m., doing the practice, deciding to go to school, going to school, coming home to do the chores, and then you practice again. And then the evening ritual of food, dinner, clean up again, and then starting the day again early in the morning to practice. And so recently we found my mom's archive of her pieces, but being able to see the work that my grandmother did, I was just really blown away in this moment, right? And the technique, because my embroidery does not look like that. This is another piece that I created with a weaving process. So thinking about weaving as a way that it was removed from my practice because of colonialism. Being in the center of Guanajuato, we don't see a lot of weavers. A lot of the weaving was able to preserve itself in the states of Oaxaca and Chiapas because colonialism took a little bit longer to get there. So when I was in grad school, I wanted to reclaim this practice and learn some of the foundations of it within the work of my images, because like my uncle who did a lot of photography, my first practice was also photography. I learned how to sew at 15 from my mom, and me creating these weavings was a way of reclaiming that, but ending the stitching, as you can see at the top, at the bottom, with thread and the sewing machine. While I was in my 20s, I went through a process of deep grief with my brother diagnosed with a mental illness and not having the resources to support him, and the stigma around our culture really impacted my 20s. And so I started to look into yoga. I started to look into meditation as a way of healing, while also really, this is when my art practice starts to thrive. And I did a 10-day silent meditation course and a 200-hour yoga training. But then I think that opens me up to begin this quilting with Puntadas del Alma, because it happened to be when my grandmother passes away, grief is happening and healing is happening. But I start to get this energy at like 4 a.m. where I wake up and I just want to sew. That's all I wanted to do. And, I started right before my grandmother passes. I kind of freeze and then focus on the textiles again. So this is the spiritual journey in my work. I was also going through a really difficult breakup. And I'm exploring here the masculine energy and the feminine energy that we all encompass, but we're not really talking about, and exploring my culture with my ancestors and how they're also the women who lift me, right, through the process of searching within, because at the silent meditation course, we weren't able to make eye contact with anyone or talk to anyone, so it was really a deep conversation with self. This is another piece that I created during that time. Then I worked at the National Museum of Mexican Art for over 13 years, but one of my biggest projects that came out of here was the Dia de los Muertos Chicago. Any of you been there? It's during Dia de los Muertos, it's outside. So I worked with an artist, Eric Garcia, and what I wanted to do, we got a big grant to project faces onto the building. But what I wanted to do, I wanted to create the building as an offering, because the National Museum of Mexican Art really focuses a lot on its Day of the Dead tradition and holiday. And so then this day we honor our loved ones, and the idea is that we talk about the 3 parts to our death. The first part is when your body gives up. The second part is when you become one with the earth. You're either cremated or you're buried with back connection with the earth. And then the third part is when you are forgotten, right? And so for us, this tradition encompasses the process of remembering and creating as well, because we have elements that bring us joy in a moment of grief. There's color to bring us life in a moment of grief, right? And movement, as well as the things that encompass our cultural element, like foods and drinks, right? Images, our spirit. Excuse me. So another idea that I had at this moment was to invite our community to create altars, and we had space for about 100 altars, but the field got so packed with altars. We had over 140 in that first year. And it was really, really special because everyone felt like it was for them, right? To be able to grieve together and remember together. And by the end of the night, we also had these mojigangas that I also created with moms in schools, and I had them do their dresses. And so you see the puppets in the back. That's another very traditional thing you see in Mexico. And I wanted them fancy, like the Catrina, the fancy Lady of Death. And so by the end of the night, people were leaving their own objects because they didn't maybe register for something, for an altar. So they started leaving cookies and random, the alcohol you see there, the spirits, and their own treats, because everyone has someone to remember. This is the collaboration with Eric Garcia and Binary Arts. And the festival is still happening to this day. If you haven't gone, I highly encourage it. So after I leave the museum, I was very confused, as I mentioned before, kind of soul-searching, exploring. And I was like, maybe I'll try going corporate and see what happens. So I go to Vienna Beef, and I sign a contract with them, and they were very generous. It's such a nice-knit community, and I were like, maybe this isn't a good fit for me. Maybe hot dogs isn't in my future. But I started applying to grad school, and I get accepted to the Art Institute. But in that transition, I also work at the Chicago History Museum, which is the former Historical Society of Chicago, but I'm hired to work with public programming. So one of the big projects that I worked on there was the Chicago race riots. So during the 1919 Chicago race riots, where the redlining is created in the city of Chicago, Eugene Williams was murdered, and it created riots and, it's a sad moment in Chicago, right? And so I created a program to invite artists from the community of Bronzeville and South Chicago, and I met Mama Kemba. who Mama Kemba at the time that I had lost my grandmother, around maybe a year later, shows up to the stage with, all of this beautiful textile and her clothing, and she shows up to the stage at 83 years old, and she starts to perform, and it was like 96 degrees that day. And she doesn't even have a sweat in her face, not a drop of sweat. And so I talked to her and I'm like, you're inspiring, you're amazing. And I thought, I've been honoring my grandmother and she's gone, she's no longer here. So I transitioned into this moment of, I want to honor those that are living, right? I want to honor Mama Kemba. And to this day, Mama Kemba sends me inspirational quotes every morning, and we're very good friends. I come over her place to have pizza and salad with her friends, and we talk about the commonalities and the differences of our culture and our families, and it's a really special moment. Every year, she has me over. And with this piece here, I'm showing the difference between when my grandmother passes away, we're arranging everything for her to be buried here because my uncles wanted it that way, because in Mexico, it's basically a ghost town now. Not a lot of family is there anymore. And so her grandchildren wanted her to be taken back home, and on the morning of, we were all very distraught. We lost our grandmother. She's not going to be home. We were sad, and my grandfather wakes up that morning and he decides we need to take her home. So we extend the process and we take her home, and I just thought it was an interesting moment how we wanted to replicate how we honor our loved ones in Mexico, which is on the right side, but here in her home in Cicero, we had as well, we had these arrangements, we had this celebration of her life. This is the altars that I create one of the altars that I've created in my home. Every year I create an altar, an offering for my loved ones. That's one of the pieces that I have created of her, which is the first time I print on fabric, because after she passed, that was what mobilized me again, to be able to see her image printed on fabric and then applicate the flowers over her. And you can see that with this piece here as well. This is my cousin, her and her pup. She passed away in her sleep when I was her age, actually, when I created this. She was 38, so I thought it was a good moment for me to connect with her since her passing. And then ironically, I ended up with a puppy that looked just very similar to hers while I was making it. So I don't know how that happened. The monarchs are often represented as well because of that the migration that the monarchs do between North and Central America. Sorry, not South. This piece I made during the pandemic while I was in grad school because I had to wrap up my studio at the school, and thankfully, I was close enough to take it to my home in Pilsen. But at this moment, I hadn't been to Mexico since my grandmother passed, and it felt like many, many years. As we all know, during the pandemic, we couldn't really move a lot and travel. And so I was just really yearning for those mountains and that sun, and the elements that give us this joy of home again, right? We're often yearning for home, and home is here in Chicago because my family is here. I was born and raised in Chicago, but when you go back to Mexico and this rooted place that taught you so much, that gave you so much, it's also home, right? After grad school, I was invited to go back to the quilting group and teach classes. So I was able to bring the work and my research that I did in grad school into my classes. So during grad school, I studied the Keshkemilala, which is a Nahuatl, the Aztec and Maya garments that were being used and defined here, as you see in the hieroglyphics. And so that garment that is in a triangle is a garment that I grew up using in my youth and my teenage years. I was really fascinated by the garment. And we might know it as a poncho. We might also know, I knew it as a mañanita. And when I started researching the garment and how long it's been preserved, I found the origin of the word is the keshkemil. So being able to find this piece just really empowered me to consider the inner goddess in me, right? And so while I'm teaching my classes, because that's what the goddesses were depicted using in their garment, with the garment. And so when I was giving classes, I started, asking the women and the men to also create and find their own inner goddess. And so this is where Puntadas del Alma comes back into my life, and I also curated a show with them, with all of their work, and I started just kind of inviting my friends too, because I think we're all yearning for connection, right? In a moment of social media, of technology, like we're all yearning for that connection, to slow down, to come back to embroidery, to come back to stillness in a way to be able to listen to our own voices while being in companionship with someone. And so I think this is a moment for me where I'm inviting my friends, like, come and join the class. And I'm inviting people at the park because I happen to live by the museum, and come to my class, I'm teaching this class. And then they were showing up. And I was like, wow, we really are, post-pandemic, we're really yearning for these practices. And so this is the part of the group, part of the Puntadas del Alma, but also newer members and people that really, some of them were like, I've been living across the street from the museum my whole life, and I've never walked in here. And I was like, wow, that's really special. And people just wanted to share their stories of being the daughter of an immigrant or the daughter of a second generation migrant, or just how textiles played a role. There was a woman who told me that her father used to make the parachutes for World War II. And I was like, wow, like, where do we capture these legacies? Where do we capture these moments? And the textile and the sewing machine have a big conversation in that, right? That we don't often talk about. And I'll get into that in a second. But this is the show that I curated at the museum with Puntadas del Alma. I'm currently working at a glass studio, the Firebird Community Arts Center, Firebird Community Arts, and I'm working with young people impacted by community violence. And so now, I'm not doing textiles there, but I'm really finding these moments and conversations where the textile and the glass are working very cohesively. And I have really big projects that I want to do right now, and we can get into that in a private conversation, but I'm really loving the fluidity of the machine and how it moves, while also being able to just discover this new material and the movement and the heat of that glass. So if you ever want to come to Firebird, please come by to see a demonstration, to make something for yourself. It's a really magical space. Well, also, I'm creating flowers because I want to find this moment where the florals of my textiles are kind of emerging out of the quilt now, right? Like what I use a lot in my textiles are flowers, and we use a practice a lot that's talking about the rose and the thorn. Like a rose is beautiful, it thrives. We even have hurts that the rose gives us. When we smell it, there's hurts that it's actually giving us scientifically. And it also has thorns, right? And it's sharp. And if you've ever pruned a rose, you will get poked, right? Because that's life. We have our goods, we have our positives and our negatives, right? Just like the rose, we grow, we are often in dark spaces, and we need water, and we need nurture, and we're searching for the light. Right, this story of resistance. And as a first-generation Latina, that is a conversation that I have with the women around me, with the people around me that have shared experiences. This is the quilt I made for Mama Kemba, and I made it for her during grad school, and she was so moved, which is why she still sends me messages every morning. But she said, "I've never been loved or appreciated more than this quilt." And she has a big, loving family, but she also worked with fabric and textiles, and she has her own practice of making hats and vests and scarves. And I didn't know this, so I think for her to be seen as a textile artist was really moving. And she also impersonates women abolitionists. And so here she's making a play about Ida B. Wells, who shared a very similar story with her because they were both born in Mississippi and they both moved to Chicago. So I wanted to give her this piece, or make this piece as a moment of that during the pandemic after the George Floyd protest. There is a writer, Corky Gonzalez, who has a really beautiful poem. It's titled I Am Joaquin, and it talks about the history of colonialism and resistance and histories of leaders and religion and so many people that have stood up to oppression. And so I presented this poem to my students at Firebird Community Arts, and it is a beautiful poem because it's 9 pages long, so it really has you reflect and dig deep. But when my students heard it, they were really moved by the shared stories of oppression and resistance and resilience. And so I had them write each their own version of their I Am Joaquin poem as an identity. And what I did here was I wanted to dedicate it to I Am Eugene, to Eugene Williams, who passed away swimming in the lake in 1919. And so I then had each student pick one line along with our therapist from the space and any of the teachers that were there. And so what the poem says is, I am Eugene, born in Georgia, raised in Chicago, swimming on a hot summer day on Lake Michigan. I am the color of my skin. I am my ancestors. I am independent. I am mother. I'm a walking testimony. I am an entrepreneur. I am happy. I am a genuine person. I am a friend and an artist. I am alone with my thoughts. I was birthed from water. I am a blessed and intelligent young man. I am a golden child. I am a brother. I am an understanding, and I am who I am. I am a son. I am a brother. I am an artist. I am full of wonder. I am who I surround myself with. I am searching. I am Eugene Williams. And this piece is now at the Corning Museum of Glass in New York in their permanent collection. But to be able to have our students write this in collaboration and then be in a permanent collection was a very powerful moment for all of us. And this is the work that I've done in glass, and just having this conversation with florals, elements. In these pieces, I'm talking about the ecology and the environment as florals and foliage, but also as the animals, and how specifically I had a friend in my class that is living in River Forest, and she was talking to me about how they were eliminating the deer because they were overpopulating, because we're removing their environment. And I was very sad about that. So I wanted to make this piece to honor the female and the male deer that, as we're taking over their spaces. And I wanted to also get local elements from the region here. So I came to Oak Park because my sister lives here. So I started photographing the natural elements in the parks and the florals, and I specifically used them in these pieces here. Llorando y Floreando is a quilt that I created the first time the president we have now was taking office, because of the way I see him maneuver humanity and the way I was seeing other men maneuver people. I thought, there's something missing there. Like, what is that? And and I was like, vulnerability, like empathy. And so I created this piece to say crying and blooming, because we all need that, right? As a humanity, we're taught to be strong. As a first generation, as a woman, as a man, you're taught, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Society just puts a lot of pressure on us, right? And so I thought I wanted to create this as an affirmation for myself, which is the beginning of a lot of affirmations that I have in my work that I'll show up next. But this was one of those moments where I was like, it's okay to be sad. I was raised to be like, why are you crying again? You're sensitive. You're this, you're that. And I feel good when I cry because I released, And so I thought about that moment. And if our president could do that, like, what a different world it would be. Another affirmation that I wrote to myself as a woman, me amo, because I don't feel like I was given the handbook of self-love, like I wasn't given the book of confidence and how to not let a guy do this to me, or not to be in this relationship, or not to do this, or not to let my friends or family just ask and ask and ask, and me never want to receive almost. And so I started creating this piece and just being like, I love myself. I'm great. I love myself. And my cousin was like, fake it till you make it, girl. Just keep going. And I think there's a lot of power in this, because I wanted to make it shiny and glittery and all things that reminded me of my own inner goddess. Hermosa y Poderosa is another space where I'm telling myself, you're lovely, cool, great, but you're also powerful, and you can be both, right? And yeah. living in a world of patriarchy, as I often have these conversations with like my cousins or my nephews, like what is feminism and how do we use it? How do we label it? What does it mean? And I think this is one of the first times that I start thinking about that, about having both be true. Every year for my grandmother's birthday, I try to have her piece go to a different home. And I also created 2 pieces of her. So one of them lives with me, and then the other one lives in her home in Mexico. And so every year I'll either like take her to my parents' house with my dad, or this year I wanted to take her to my cousin's house with her daughter. And so it's just a moment that we get to talk about her again and talk about her stories and almost hold her like she's giving us a hug. And it's really nice to have the grandchildren also just be in conversation with us. And this is the process of me also just like being in her home and at the cemetery in her home. And going back to the conversation of women and women that have cultivated these practices that are not often carried the conversation of fine art. And many times we hear quilting as a craft. And I started, like I mentioned, unraveling, going to my home. And then one year I go to Malia's house, which is the woman here who's right in the center of the piece. She's holding the bouquet a little bit lower. And this piece is actually at the Art Institute right now. It's in the exhibition on Loss and Absence, if you want to see it in person. It's a really beautiful work, but Amalia shared this piece with me, this picture with me, and said, look, these are the women that used to sew together in the town. And I was really moved by that, because when I looked really closely, I found my aunt, my grandmother, who's all the way on the right-hand side, the young girl in the lower level, the lower aisle. And then I found my great auntie in the photograph, and my cousin shared it with one of her staff members, and she was like, that's my grandmother. And so I thought that we were the next generation of women who are able to learn these practices and cultivate this. So this was exhibited at the National Museum of Mexican Art in 2023. And then somebody sent me another photograph from the town. They emailed it to me, and it was this image. And I thought, how special is it that the sewing machines are here? Because in this image, it was all, the work was done by hand, embroidery, cross stitch. And then in this image, the sewing machines have touched the next generation. So this piece is living in Vienna, Austria, at the Dom Wien Museum. And I had my grandmother, my mom, and her sister, who I mentioned were the ones that learned most of the practices, sew here in the hot pink to mend the photograph because it was a little torn. And this is current work that I've been exploring within other communities of migration and traditions and culinary, and how, this is a very global conversation of migrating. The person on the left side is my great-grandmother, and Auntie Mei is on the right-hand side from China, who left her home. Actually, she was left behind from her home, and all her family migrated to the United States, and Auntie Mei was left because they had to leave one child behind, and it had to be a woman. And Auntie Mei stayed with her grandparents So she learned a lot of the traditions, a lot of the culture from China, and she rejoined her parents and family until she was about 18 years old. So another story of the separation and the nostalgia that lands within that separation. And this is a story of second and third generations of a family all from Indiana and South Bend. So we have these different pockets throughout the country, right, of migration. Like we tend to migrate together, like from the town where my family's from. A lot of the people came to Chicago. And so this family was where they were from Texas, and a lot of them moved to South Bend. This is my grandmother's piece, just envisioning and creating her back in the original image where she took the picture was in these specific lands. In this image, it is my great-grandmother, and I just wanted her to take up space in the city while I was in grad school. And that is all I have. Thank you so much. I just finished this piece like a week ago. And it is my first self-portrait on a quilt. It was taken in my 20s. A lot of my work is very reflective, and I had a friendship for 20 years. We parted ways, and in it, I'm looking at myself while also wanting the person viewing it to take a look at themselves. And so I wrote pieces it's from a mirror, and I was holding the mirror, and I was holding my camera, and even while doing the piece, I'm like, how did I take this photograph? I don't even remember because I had it in so many years ago. But in the mirror, in the black part of the mirror, I wrote, "You're perfect." Because again, these affirmations of what I want my audience to know about themselves. And then I also wrote, like, "You're never alone," and I also wrote, "I'm healing while I'm living." And so these messages are embedded into the quilt with free motion, and that's another piece of the process that I didn't talk a lot about. But with free motion, you remove the foot of the machine, and you're able to draw with the machine.
I see this piece, and it looks like paper almost. Mm-hmm. Is it paper?
It is.
And then
paper.
You wove it?
Yes.
Okay, and the other pieces were on cotton or, yeah. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually one piece that is on canvas. This piece here is printed on canvas and then woven together.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And are some of these pieces 3D? So the roses come out and are on it, or are they flat against and then you quilt it?
They're flat, but I'll use more layering to make them look like they're dimensional.
So I'm really interested in how you start. How do you sketch it? Do you think, whatever, and how do you also determine what the size is going to be?
My process is digitally. So I start with the image and then collaging digitally within Photoshop or a software, and then from there I print on fabric, and that is done in a lab at the Art Institute, or I send it out to get printed on depending on scale, because these machines can only go a certain amount of width for printing on cotton. And so my scale started off kind of small. small, and I think now I'm just trying to take up space because I'm 4'11", and I just want this scale to be vast. I want our stories to be larger, and that is where this scaling is coming from at this moment.
So you mentioned free arm quilting. Are you doing that yourself?
Yes.
And you must have, how long an arm does your sewing machine have for something that size?
Yes, so I just recently purchased one last year. I've had it for a year, but I started off with I broke a lot of machines too, because I started wanting to go big, and I was using a very regular Singer basic, like metal-based, but then I transitioned to a Juki with it has a pretty wide, the width is larger now. But I did try the standing ones, and there was something about it that I wasn't resonating with. I like that my body is moving with the work, because I think there's a lot to say in that motion of creating, personally.
Tell us about the process you do in the glass works.
The glassworks, yes. So there's two processes that I use. This one is flame working, and so that is a little torch, and it's actually hotter than the furnace that is used for glass blowing. The torch has about 3,000 degrees, and it's about like a small flame, and this is a lot of motion. So you have to constantly be turning the piece to create this piece specifically. And then in these works, and this one is very individual, I can do it by myself, but these, you need a community, you need people to help, because of the material of glass. If you're familiar with it, it's like honey. Like if you're not moving the piece, it's going to start dripping, and it's coming out of a furnace that's 2,000 degrees. And so you need to maintain it at a certain heat to have it be working, right? And if it gets too cold, it will break off. If you burn one part off, then it's not going to have this shape. This would all be lumping together. So I have peers help me, and some students have helped me as well. We call it bringing bits into the material. But this is still my prototyping era, like if you will. Right now I'm thinking more about sculpture and glass of installations, and we'll see where that lands.
My mother and grandmother sewed their whole lives. My Italian grandmother had that same sewing machine. Mm-hmm. My mother made my wedding suit. But on the florals, were you inspired by Choluli?
I'm very new to the glass world, so I'm not very familiar with a lot of the makers, but that name sounds very familiar.
How long did it take you from the planning to the finishing for that quilt?
For this piece, it took me about a year. And I work cohesively, so like in the process I was creating these two pieces, but these are way smaller, and I finished these, started all of them at the same time, but this one was a lot because of the scale and rolling up and tying, and yeah.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate everyone.